morning, and welcome to Rising. Happy Monday. We are back at it again, me and my boy Niall Stanage. Nice to see you, my friend.
Glad to be back with you, Robby, after a week's vacation for me, which I enjoyed in my native Ireland and Britain.
And you unplugged, I hear.
I unplugged from mostly all online content, read print newspapers like an old man.
What are those?
I think I was about the only person reading them, but it was an enjoyable time off, but I'm glad to be back with you. So why don't you get us started? What is on your radar, Robby?
Let's get right to it. I think we might fight over this one. It'll be fun. The knives are out for Senator John Fetterman. The Pennsylvania Democrat is popular in his home state and well-liked by many independents, moderates, and even Republicans. But he is loathed by progressive Democrats and the left. Now the mainstream media is turning on him with a level of malice not evinced by them since, well, Joe Biden's cognitive collapse during the presidential debate caused the MSM to revolt overnight against their preferred candidate. Indeed, Fetterman's situation bears remarkable similarity to the Biden situation. Both men have been credibly accused of health-related, or in Biden's case, age-related, cognitive impairments that might render them not fit for government work. But as with Biden, the question you should be asking is this: why now? Why is it suddenly okay to scrutinize Fetterman's fitness for public service? Recall that when conservatives raised questions about Fetterman's condition back in 2022, I was one of them, when he was running for Senate against Republican Dr. Oz, the media covered for him at every turn. They held up his perseverance as brave. They treated it as admirable that he was sticking it out despite obvious impairment. What changed since then? I think I know, and I bet you do too. But let's back up a little bit. You probably all remember back in 2022, while running for the crucial Senate seat in the swing state of Pennsylvania, that Fetterman suffered a stroke. It was obvious that this was a serious blow to the senator's health and had left him verbally impaired at the very least. In his subsequent debate with Republican opponent Dr. Oz, Fetterman had trouble speaking in complete sentences. Let's flash back for a moment.
Just a second, Mr. Oz. I do want to clarify something. You're saying tonight that you support fracking, that you've always supported fracking, but there is that 2018 interview that you said, quote, "I don't support fracking at all." So how do you square the two?
I do support fracking, and I support fracking, and I stand and I do support fracking.
It was painful to watch. Biden's catastrophic debate performance in July 2024 looks Churchillian by comparison, and it's why I said at the time that I didn't possibly see how Fetterman could continue with his campaign. He was clearly not up for taking on such a demanding job. Nevertheless, Fetterman won the race and was elected to the Senate. Today, Fetterman's health is once again a topic of discussion because of a recent profile of him, some would say hit piece, in New York Magazine. We discussed it on Rising last week, but since then, media chatter about that piece has increased, prompting much subsequent discussion and take-having among the pundit class. Indeed, Axios took New York Magazine's ball and ran with it, publishing a report that claims, quote, Capitol Hill's private concerns over Fetterman exploded into public view over the past week as longtime critics and former allies piled on with concerns about the senator. The main originator of the anti-Fetterman campaign is Adam Gentleson, a former chief of staff who was the primary source for the New York Magazine article. Most of the other sources in that piece were unnamed staffers. You know, it's really amazing to me that when they really want to, mainstream reporters seem to have no trouble finding political insiders who are willing to speak up about their boss's alleged cognitive decline. Again, we're supposed to believe that Biden's infirmity was this closely guarded secret and that the media was totally bamboozled by it. That just doesn't seem totally plausible, given how easily mainstream reporters seem to find aggrieved staffers to spout off when they set their mind to it. Now look, I'm perfectly willing to believe that Fetterman is still reeling from his stroke or the subsequent depression he suffered, and ultimately should not be in the Senate. Okay, but here's the thing. The media organizations that are now insistent that something is wrong mentally with John Fetterman are the very same ones that went to the mat 3 years ago to protect Fetterman at all costs. They didn't just cover for his health problems, they hailed him as brave for continuing to run anyway. For instance, The Atlantic is now slamming Fetterman's defenders for ignoring evidence that he is, quote, unfit for office. But back in 2022, immediately after the stroke, The Atlantic ran an article cheering Fetterman on. It was called The Survivor Vote, How John Fetterman's Stroke Helped Deepen His Everyman Appeal Among Some Supporters. They were spinning his stroke as nearly a positive development. Rolling Stone, same thing, reported at the time that the stroke was no big deal. Plenty of politicians needed medical treatment in the past. You'll have to take my word for it, but that broadly was characteristic of the media coverage at the time. Fetterman is fine. What are you even talking about? Everything is fine. Vote Democrat. Which brings us back to the initial question, what changed? We all know in the years since he was first elected to the Senate, Fetterman has turned out to be much more moderate than expected. He's not a progressive, he's cordial with Trump and the GOP, and perhaps most relevant of all, he is firmly and decisively on the side of Israel. This has estranged him from the progressive left and their allies in mainstream media, as well as his progressive staff, and apparently his own wife, Giselle Fetterman, who is much more liberal than he is. And so it's open season on Fetterman. Now, I'm not saying Fetterman's political views are the correct ones, although I will note his move to the right had made him more popular in his home state, not less. If his re-election was held today, he'd probably win by an even more comfortable margin. Nor am I saying that you should ignore evidence of mental incapacity, even if it's being presented opportunistically and in bad faith. What I am saying is that all of this reveals more about our media class than it does about Fetterman specifically. Once again, evidence of infirmity was selectively and conveniently ignored by the mainstream media, until such ignorance no longer served the interests of the Democratic Party. This is why so many Americans don't trust them.
Provocative, Robby, but we're certainly going to get off to a robust start.
Let me have it, Niall. And again, and I just want to make clear, I'm not asserting that he is fine and he is fit for office. I don't know that for certain. I had questions years ago about him. So I am not defending, I'm not going to do the Biden thing, but I do find it a little hypocritical how the knives are out for him now. What do you think?
First of all, I think in general it is almost always better to have more information than less information. The nature of political journalism in particular is that sources often have mixed motives at best for saying things, but having that information allows viewers, readers, whatever, to make judgments for themselves. So is the information accurate? Is John Fetterman now prone to sort of repetitive or paranoid ramblings, as is suggested? Is he off his treatment plan? Those are relevant things. Now, as for the media critique, I think here's where I think I have the biggest difference with the case you laid out, which is I don't think it is fair or accurate to say that the media covered for Fetterman first time around. When he was campaigning, the big exhibition of his problems was the debate that we played a brief clip from. Look, I looked up some of the headlines from that. AP's headline, Fetterman struggles in Senate debate against Oz after stroke. Axios's headline, Fetterman's painful debate. CNN's first sentence, Democrat John Fetterman's debate performance has intensified the focus on his recovery from a stroke. So in the same way as Biden's debate really sharpened all these questions, I think the Fetterman Senate debate did so, and the media covered it appropriately at the time.
There was very little criticism from fellow Democrats at the time, perhaps, the way there is now for him. And I think it has to do with him no longer being seen as a useful implement for them, given that his views are much more right-wing than they expected.
Well, I mean, they're certainly much more on the Israel question. I mean, one of the things that people like me have a grievance against him for isn't merely being pro-Israel. It's for expressing a kind of glee about the suffering of the Palestinians. That has certainly alienated him from considerable numbers of people in the Democratic camp. I don't know what Adam Gentelson's motives are, whether they are pure, impure, or somewhere in between. But I don't think we disagree that it is in the public interest to know that people have fears about John Fetterman's fitness for office.
I have a hard time believing he's in worse shape now than he was then. That's the difficulty I have with this, because he was not able to communicate on a basic level when he was running for the Senate seat after the stroke, which was an unfortunate thing. It came out of nowhere. I'm not blaming anyone for backing Fetterman up until that point, and then it was an uncomfortable situation where, like, I don't know what you do, but I don't know how this person can serve in the Senate. And then he actually recovered from that speaking incapacitation to a greater degree than I necessarily expected. And now they say he's evincing all these other cognitive issues. It just seems, well, it's not as bad as it was then.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just think it's good that we know these things and we can evaluate it, and Fetterman has denied that there's any problem, and we'll take it from there. I'm just not sure it's a media conspiracy.
Fair enough.
In any event, next up on Rising, the White House is looking at suspending Habeus Corpus. Are they going too far? White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller made a bold and controversial statement last Friday.
The White House has tried various methods to crack down on illegal immigration. Here's Miller teasing a new one.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So to say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
Habeas corpus is the principle that allows people to fight their detainment in court. Miller's comments ignited instant criticism. Senator Amy Klobuchar wrote on X, "Congress is not going to reverse habeas corpus, and no, the president can't do it himself. Why does Stephen Miller bring it up on a Friday? To try to distract us from the havoc they are wreaking across the economy."
The Lincoln Project, a political action committee founded by former Republican Party members, wrote, "Suspending habeas corpus, let that sink in." Of course, many other conservatives were quick to point out the irony. Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk wrote, "The Lincoln Project is outraged about a president potentially limiting habeas corpus in response to a national emergency. Who's going to tell him?" Of course, Abraham Lincoln was famously someone who suspended habeas corpus, which is not something I agree with, to be clear.
Yeah.
I do not think habeas corpus should be suspended. I actually have a lot of criticisms of Lincoln. I think it is helpful to occasionally remember that even our beloved greatest national hero presidents, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, Wilson has really had a historical reckoning that I think is good. Those other figures less so. Did things violate FDR, beloved, progressive architect of the New Deal, interned Japanese Americans. Lincoln violated all sorts of civil liberties in his prosecution of the Civil War, and so on. I think that's always helpful to remember. I don't think we're going to disagree here. I am not in favor of suspending habeas corpus at this moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point about Lincoln is that there is the provision in the Constitution to suspend habeas corpus in cases of rebellion or invasion, as the public safety may require it. Plainly, in the case of the Civil War, you couldn't get a more textbook example of rebellion. To your point about the other presidents, FDR, for example, and the internment of Japanese Americans, to me that's just an indicator of the fact that this stuff never works out well, that the suspension of liberties or transgression of constitutional norms is always a bad thing.
Yes.
Now, the Trump administration, and Stephen Miller in particular, are using the argument that there is an invasion going on by illegal migrants. That is an argument that not only I don't believe, which is neither here nor there, but courts have already struck down in several cases, including a Trump-appointed judge in Texas in relation to the Alien Enemies Act, saying that it was unlawful for the Trump administration to detain or deport people on that basis, saying there is not an invasion. So to me, this is part of a piece of the Trump administration's push against civil liberties generally and expanding presidential power in a very, very dangerous way.
And the expansion of presidential power always backfires against your own cause. And if I was to try to, persuade a MAGA or a conservative person why they shouldn't get on board with this, I'm not even sure everyone in the administration wants to do this. Stephen Miller, to my mind, is increasingly one of the most out there in the kinds of very authoritarian statements he is willing to make to the press. He frankly seems to enjoy doing that. I think he loves riling up the media by saying authoritarian things. And
yeah, but I think he believes the authoritarian things, which is where the danger lies.
I think he does.
Right.
I think he thinks there would be no problem with authoritarianism as long as Trump is in charge.
Exactly.
I think he just doesn't see any of the slippery slope downsides.
Right.
I think slippery slope arguments are always correct, as I've told you. And we don't look, as you noted, we don't look back fondly on times where we allowed our liberty to be compromised for some public safety measure. Maybe unlike you, I see why conservatives would term the extent of the illegal immigration we have coming into the country, they would use the term invasion. There is a lot of disorder at the southern border. I wouldn't really bother myself quibbling over that point, but I would still say in response to that, well, how much liberty are we willing to lose to deal with that problem? And I would point to we don't need to go back to Japanese internment or the Civil War. We can point to the very recent example of the war on terror. This is within our lifetimes. This is 25 years ago, where in a moment of genuine concern for our country, for our safety, we didn't know, we have enemies everywhere all of a sudden, it's very dangerous, very scary time, we allowed our government to take a lot of our liberty in the name of public safety. And it was wildly popular to do so, and Republicans and Democrats, you know, a couple crank fringe members on both sides, your Ron Wydens and your Ron Pauls and your et cetera, objected to it, but everyone else pretty much marched in lockstep. Now, on a bipartisan basis, we really do recognize a lot of that as overreach. It is no longer controversial to say, man, I wish we had not given the Patriot Act so much leeway. Man, I wish we'd not done a lot of this stuff. The same liberties we will suspend to deal with the illegal immigration problem, I bet we would come back in a couple years or a couple decades and say, man, we went too far on that because look what we have to deal with now.
Sure. So for a start, there, in relation to the September 11th example, there's an old phrase, foul deeds require fair trial. And it's the idea that public outrage shouldn't be allowed to meddle or hinder or damage the basic administration of justice, or for that matter, the administration of civil liberties. Now, in the Trump administration's case, what I would note is rhetoric from Stephen Miller and others that has been hitting against the very principle of the judicial branch having its own authority. They don't seem to believe that it should have that authority. The Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, where the man was wrongfully deported in contravention of an immigration court order, the flights under the Alien Enemies Act that were ordered to turn back and were not done so, the suggestion that judges are involved in a judicial coup. This is an administration that does not really believe in pluralism or the separation of powers or the checks and balances, and therein lies the danger.
Right. I mean, their view is we were democratically elected to correct some of these problems, and we're willing to use extreme measures to do it, and we're not going to let the justice system stand in our way. We have a public mandate to do it. We won the election. That's their view. Right. I don't agree with that view. That is their view, and I would respond to it by saying, but you're not going to win every time, and we can't design systems from the conservative perspective that will be easily abused by progressives or Democrats or anyone else.
Well, and the government of the United States should not act unlawfully. That seems a fairly basic bedrock principle.
How about that? The Trump administration has granted refugee status to white South Africans. We'll get into that next.
One group of refugees are receiving a warm welcome from the Trump administration. A stark contrast, as most refugees have been halted from entering the U.S. The exception, white South Africans. They are set to land in the U.S. today. And these Afrikaners, white descendants of primarily Dutch colonizers, have been singled out favourably by this administration.
President Trump is claiming they are victims of racial discrimination. He says they're being persecuted by their black-led government because of their race.
As a reminder, South Africa was controlled under apartheid rule for decades by its white minority. Under that system, black South Africans were denied basic rights. That system came to an end in 1994. And the current South African government is hitting back hard against Trump's allegations, saying it's completely false. They say Afrikaners are some of the richest and most successful people in the country.
White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller commented on the situation. Let's take a look.
What's happening in South Africa fits the textbook definition of why the refugee program was created. This is persecution based on a protected characteristic, in this case, race.
Others are hitting back on those claims. Journalist Jemele Hill writes on X, today, white people own 72% of the private farmland in South Africa, despite being only 7% of the population. Do with that information what you will.
What's going on, or disagreement, and the white South Africans want to come here. Why is that not a desirable outcome to make the country more peaceful?
The issue is the double standard of prohibiting entrance to the United States too.
So you're not really objecting to these people coming here. You're saying that it's just other people should not be.
Yeah, it is a selective application of policy that seems to me, and I'm generally reluctant to make these arguments, but in this case it seems to me the obvious common sense conclusion is it is done as a sort of appeal to white American racial grievance. Because look at all the other countries where there is far more egregious persecution of groups, the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, all sorts of, Libya is racked by all kinds of bloodshed, and we're not letting them in. We're letting the descendants of the drivers of apartheid in.
I think the Trump administration looks at it in a, well, who do we want in this country and who will contribute to order and wealth and prosperity here, and who will contribute to disorder or greater crime or something like that. You said, we read that these are, I don't care about the race of the people whatsoever. I care about their wealth status, whether they're going to be net contributors or users of the welfare state. There's a wealthy people. I want wealthy people all over the globe to come to America. I want to ease our immigration rules so that can be wealthy Indians, wealthy Chinese people, wealthy South African people, people who are going to be net contributors to the economy. I want them all to come here independent of race. So I just don't have a problem with this.
Yes, but Robby, let's not...
the Rohingya and some of those other groups you mentioned, I mean, those are refugees. I mean, they're in horrible situations, and I might be perfectly willing myself to open our programs to them.
Right.
But I think some of the concerns that will be raised are going to be about, well, are they going to be net drags on the economy?
But that's a much bigger topic of migration. Here we're talking specifically about refugees and groups that face persecution. And Afrikaners would not rank among the top groups that face persecution in the world.
All right.
In the meantime, the art of the deal or an economic surrender, Trump's temporary tariff rollback is next. Stay with us.
And what had occurred with these very high tariffs was the equivalent of an embargo, and neither side wants that. We want more balanced trade, and I think that both sides are committed to achieving that.
We have a deal. U.S. and Chinese officials said on Monday they've agreed to a 90-day pause on most of the tariffs they placed on each other. That announcement coming out of weekend discussions in Switzerland. According to a joint statement from the two countries, U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports will be slashed by 115 percentage points, from a 145% tariff to just 30%. China's tariffs on U.S. imports also will come down 115 percentage points, from 125 to just 10. The deal also includes a promise to establish a mechanism to continue discussions about economic and trade relations. The news seemed to give Wall Street a boost. Markets opened sharply up this morning. The Dow is up 2.24%. NASDAQ is up 3.22%. S&P is up 2.38%. Meantime, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had this to say this morning on Fox & Friends.
This is an extraordinary first step in the right direction, and thanks to the strength of President Trump, Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer were able to cut this initial deal with China. China agreed to reduce their tariffs on the United States by 115%, and they also agreed to continue seriously discussing the grave impact that Chinese-produced fentanyl is having right here in the United States.
Editor-in-Chief of the Midas Touch, Ron Filipkowski, responded to Leavitt in a post on X, saying, quote, China agreed to reduce the tariffs they raised in response to Trump's tariffs, after Trump agreed to lower his tariffs. Create a problem, surrender, then declare victory.
Well, I don't know which way you want to slice it, but I am so glad that we've negotiated a deal and the tariffs are going away.
Sure.
And that's the point of threatening the tariffs is what I think the Scott Bessents of the administration will say was to come up with a more favorable arrangement. Now, I'm sure what you're going to say, and the cynics are going to say, is we're actually just back to square one anyway.
I hope you're not accusing me of cynicism, Robby. Perish the very thought.
I think it would be fair to wonder why with China this was worth doing, because again, the argument for China was there's national security concerns. Now, Trump people feel like they got something favorable in terms of commitment to address the fentanyl crisis. That was in their press release on this. and some other non-tariff-related malfeasance that China is guilty of. But the markets certainly like to see the tariffs come down, and I hope that will serve as a good lesson to all.
So you and I do have some common ground here in that we have both been sceptical of the tariffs since they were introduced. In fact, since before they were introduced. And one of the things I think we do agree on is the idea that these tariffs were going to be kept in place for the months or years that would be required to spark a regeneration of American manufacturing was just nonsense. That was just never going to happen.
Fantasy.
And so that was the view that had been put by people like Peter Navarro in particular, and that isn't going to happen, obviously, because there has been this, I would say climb down, you probably wouldn't use that word, but the tariffs have been greatly, greatly reduced in relation to China. On the politics of it, the problem that I have, and it was typified by Caroline Levitt's interview there, talking about this is thanks to the strength of President Trump. It is just amazing that Trump has this propensity to drive the car into the ditch and no one says anything, or people praise his innovative driving. And then when he finally finds reverse gear to get out of the mess into which he's put himself, we are expected to praise his strategic genius. It is just an absurd kind of contention and frankly somewhat cultish, and I think we should get away from that.
I think it would have been better for the administration to prioritize the Chinese tariffs and not do the other tariffs, and that would have been a clearer sign that no, China is an outlier in its tariff policy, in its threats to our own national security, to global security really, to its authoritarian nature internally in its country, to what it puts our tech companies through and our other companies when they want, like the NBA and everybody, when they want to be involved there. You can't criticize them at all. I find that absolutely morally abhorrent. The stealing of the IP, the other things. There are China-specific issues that if you were going to sell a tariff regime targeting that country on some other grounds, I think but that would behoove you to have even more favorable trade relations everywhere else. Now, they keep saying they're hammering out all these deals. There was positive progress with the UK last week. Actually, I was on the BBC.
Oh, excellent!
As they were hammering out that deal.
You should have told me.
Talking about that, isn't that nice?
I would have plugged myself back into media to hear your words of wisdom on the topic.
It was very exciting. So there was that, and other countries. And look, I am, as you know, even though I'm in the right side of the table, I'm not a big fan of tariff policies in general. Republicans have typically not been big supporters of tariffs. Actually, it's been some Democrats in the past who are more supportive of tariffs, which is why I've found it interesting that some, even now, like Gretchen Whitmer and Elizabeth Warren and others, have tried to say, well, we don't like the way Trump is doing it, but we want to reserve this power for when we're back in charge for a variety of reasons. And Biden maintained some of the tariffs that Trump put in place with respect to China. I am glad to see tariffs falling away. The markets will reward Trump, and it could be that by the time midterms roll around, that this is going to be a long forgotten brief interruption to the markets. I hope for the sake of our economy that that's the case, not just narrowly for the Republican Party's political fortunes.
So in relation to the midterms and the politics, I think it is very notable that Trump has pulled his horns back in on this because, to my mind, he saw the potential political damage on his own presidency. We saw the numbers disapproving of his tariff policy and his general handling of the economy shoot up. And for all Trump's other flaws, and I'm quite happy to enunciate those, he does have political antennae that I think picked up on the fact that this was going to be politically disastrous for him. And so he has made this U-turn. I don't think he deserves particular praise for it, but it certainly mitigates the politically detrimental impact.
Absolutely. Well, coming up, a testy interview between Bill Maher and David Hogg actually ended up in a surprise exchange where they seemed to get along. It was really good, great clip. We'll discuss it. Stay tuned. David Hogg is slamming the Democratic Party for alienating young men. His remarks may have won over comedian Bill Maher.
The often provocative DNC chair was on Maher's show over the weekend, explaining why he thought Democrats lost in November and challenging the party to change course. Let's watch.
We've created a culture where we say, well, if you say the wrong thing, you're excommunicated. And that's just not how human beings work. Nobody is perfect, but ultimately what we have to do here is figure out how to bring people back in and work towards the bigger goal of advancing the future of this country and helping young people especially get by so that they're able to focus on their lives and, getting with a young woman or something like that instead of how are they going to pay their rent, for example, or how are they working their 2 jobs. Young people should be able to focus on what young people should be focused on, which is how to get laid and how to go and have fun. Rather,
David Hogg for president, ladies and gentlemen.
Maher clearly liked what he heard, as you saw there. He capped off the interview by clapping, standing up and shaking Hogg's hand.
Meanwhile, Maher also torched Democrats for listening to young voters and embracing radical ideas. He says the party went from men can have babies to we like the terrorists.
So much to discuss here, Robby.
So much to discuss. I appreciate that David Hogg prepared a sales pitch for Bill Maher that was very up Bill Maher's alley,
so.
and it worked because he got applause and a handshake.
Right.
You know, it's you'll probably feel this way too. You know, he's like saying on one hand this is a difficult line to walk because. Clearly, the Democratic Party alienating young people, particularly young men of all racial categories, is a major issue and has to do with how cultural elites, progressive, speak to young people, speak in general. There's something off-putting and hectoring about it. I don't think we really disagree there. At the same time, though, then Maher will be like, but don't listen to young people in terms of their radical economic agenda, which I also agree with, but there's kind of a discordant thing there.
Oh, 100%. I mean, look, there is at the core of what Hogg said a legitimate point, and you and I have discussed this before. Democrats, and Kamala Harris particularly, did not do well with young men. According to the most comprehensive voter survey, President Biden back in 2020 had carried men under 45 by 7 points. Last November, Trump carried them by 8 points. That's an appreciable swing in Trump's direction. That's obviously a problem for Democrats. David Hogg's making an argument about censoriousness, I think, and the idea that if you say the wrong thing, you'll be excommunicated. That, I think, is a valid point. I do think that sometimes there has been a degree of sort of almost puritanism entering the liberal circles in terms of how you can speak about certain issues. Now, then you look at the other side, which is, you know, the Republican views on abortion or drag shows or book bans. I mean, those are pretty censorious views. The bigger problem I have, and I want to let you get in first, Maher went on to lambaste young people not only for their economic radicalism, but for their views on the Middle East and on the Palestinians in particular, which I've got much to say about, but why don't you get back in first?
On that subject, Maher's a little bit even to my right,
right.
And we're going to talk more about the Middle East a little bit later on the show. Probably some people watching are like, what are you talking about, the puritanism of the Democratic Party? But I know exactly what they're getting at, because Maher has long criticized some of these things I've talked about with respect to college campuses and sexual misconduct adjudication that did spill out into the broader culture as a result of Me Too, where there were a lot of young people, you know, there were also a lot of really crude and awful and abusive, you know, large executives and big, important, powerful people who were correctly held to account. There were also a lot of young people who just said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing. And I mean, what happened to Aziz Ansari, who's a famous person, but that whole write-up on his date gone wrong that was like, it was the poster child to me for Me Too overreach. Like, why are we having to confront what was just a awkward but normal bad date experience for someone being treated like he's Harvey Weinstein.
That was the one where the woman expressed concern because he had the wrong kind of wine or something.
Yeah, it was
peculiar
nuts.
one.
It was
yeah.
And it was not published by a reputable outlet. It was published by Babe.net. Well, sorry to speak poorly of Babe.net. That kind of thing is what I'm sure David Hogg is talking about, and Bill Maher is talking about, and the not so much the Democratic Party, but progressive cultural tastemakers are associated with that vibe, and it is that vibe more than anything that I think has lost them so many young men.
Well, that may be true. I think that there is something off-putting about that, and I think we see the consequences of that point. In relation to Bill Maher,
yes,
he has the capacity on topics like that to exhibit real critical thinking and some kind of rigorous analysis, and that is often missing on the liberal side. It's often missing, I would argue, on the conservative side about Republican beliefs. But what I find very difficult to get past with Maher is that when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, that critical thinking seems to completely desert him in favor of a reflexive, extreme pro-Israel position that doesn't even seem to grasp why young people in particular are critical of a campaign that has killed more than 50,000 people. And he talks, I mean, in the show, the same episode of the show as Hogg was on, he was arguing that their young people, by which he means Democrats, now don't like their own civilization. They like the wrong one, suggesting sympathy toward Hamas. There's all sorts of things where he just doesn't countenance the idea that there are principled, reasonable, I would say, compelling reasons to be outraged at what is happening in that part of the world.
Yeah, this is sort of getting into a subject I've wanted to do a full segment on, probably with a guest, maybe frankly with a guest on both sides. This whole, have you heard of the woke right discourse that's taking place? Are you familiar with this term? Oh. It's very confusing. I was talking about it actually with Emily Jashinsky, who used to co-host with us. She has a show on Unheard, and we were talking about a variety of things, but eventually became a subject about the woke right. This is a description that a couple people, including James Lindsay, who's very active on social media, he's kind of an arch-libertarian of my views, is trying to assert that other people who you probably don't agree with and don't like very much, for the most part, are the woke right. It's like Tim Pool is the woke right, or some of the guests that have appeared on Joe Rogan are the woke right. Like he's taking the Douglas Murray side of this argument, and I largely agree with him on a lot of issues, but specifically on the Douglas Murray versus Dave Smith thing, even though I like and I'm friendly with Douglas Murray and I agree with a lot of what he does, I am more on the Dave Smith of that side of that particular conflict. Because for just the reasons you outlined, I think you should be independent-minded about what is happening with Israel and Gaza. And is it just so then it's reducible to, okay, by woke right, do you just mean people who have a different view of Israel than you do? Because I do think there is something to talk about in the strategies being adopted by some of the people on the right to fight, like Stephen Miller, to wield power. And I'm the one saying, don't use the ring, Boromir. We got to destroy the ring. Right. We can't use it to vanquish Sauron. We'll become just like it. And so I agree with James Lindsay about that. But then it gets a little bit lost in the weeds when we start talking about foreign policy, which is where I do want to see something different and iconoclastic. So I'd like to hash these discussions out with a representative of both sides of this argument.
Yeah, I mean,
we'll track them down.
I mean, I just think that in the Israel-Gaza situation, there is just inexplicable support for a egregious campaign of starvation and, frankly, slaughter, and how it is supported so vigorously as a conservative position, or why the United States should be underwriting that campaign financially and diplomatically, is a complete mystery to me. And I don't think it may be the case that more people on the left are broadly pro-Palestinian, but I don't think you have to be of the left to see the problems with it.
Well, fair enough, but that does go both ways, because there's basically ironclad support for Israel in the Democratic Party, and is some dissent and debate taking. I mean, certainly on the left, but also on the right about our funding commitment to Israel. I mean, to represent the other side, I would say, well, they were attacked by a terrorist group. Horrible things happen in war. This is war between a nation state and a terrorist group on its borders, and it's really ugly, but we were prepared to nuke every city in Japan until they surrendered. When they surrender, there'll be no more violence. Now, do we have to be, that's the moral reason for what they're doing. I would still say, even if that was the case, why does it need to be the U.S.'s issue? Are we empowering it to go further than it would otherwise because we're subsidizing it?
We're empowering blatant war crimes, in my opinion.
All right. Up next, we will talk about Qatar's grand gesture towards President Trump. Stay tuned. Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is attracting controversy again after making some remarks that some say lean a bit heavily into identity politics. Speaking on Sirius XM's Urban View Town Hall Friday, Crockett claimed Democrats already made their choice for the 2028 presidential candidate, and she said it's, quote, the safest white boy. She continued saying, quote, I had a donor on the phone with me telling me that all the donors are lining up behind that candidate, so I can tell, and I tell you, It's not a black person nor a woman, okay? In the now viral video that co-host Clay Kane shared, Crockett didn't name names, but dropped a hint that the party has a specific candidate in mind.
Crockett has gotten into hot water recently. If you recall, she referred to wheelchair-bound Texas Governor Greg Abbott as Hot Wheels, for which she was nearly censured. She later claimed her words were twisted. And last year, she traded fiery insults with Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene during a House hearing where they talked about each other's physical appearance.
Social media lit up with reactions. X account Conservative Brief posted, quote, "Safest white boy, delusional Democrat Representative Jasmine Crockett brings up race again, this time claiming the party wants to play it safe in 2028. Red State X account posted, quote, "Oh my, Jasmine Crockett just stepped in it again with comments about who the donors want in 2028. The full Urban View Town Hall will be released on May 15th, which I presume is why we can't play a clip from it, sadly.
Sadly.
You know, my response to this would be like, okay, name names. I'm not going to contradict what you heard from a donor. Who is this safe white boy they're lining up behind? I think if she had just said, you know, the party at its most elite level is risk averse and clearly preferences older establishment figures. It certainly does in terms of congressional leadership. She would have said something that's uncontroversial that I completely agree with, that is actually an attractive thing to say to independent-minded people, how the Democratic Party at its elite level has conspired against interesting, out-of-the-box people. I think by making it a kind of race thing, well, A, it just is, then conservatives are just going to bash the hell out of it, and then it has a ring of falseness to me because, well, Kamala Harris was just she was the choice of, I mean, I'm not saying there's something illegitimate about it, but she was the choice of the establishment and the party and the donors and everybody, and she was a black woman. So it's not really about race so much to me, right?
I don't always defend Jasmine Crockett. I think she's prone to saying some kind of pointless or certainly disputable things often. The thing here that I would defend her on, though, is I don't think that what she's saying is really that controversial. As is often the case with her, the way she puts it inflames conservatives and she gets a lot of criticism for it. But, I mean, I think her argument is very simply that in the 3 presidential elections post-Barack Obama, Democrats have lost 2 and won 1. And the one that they were victorious in was with an old white guy, i.e. Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton lost and Kamala Harris lost. And therefore, it seems sort of self-evident that there are Democrats who are nervous about nominating another woman or a person of color, non-white person, whatever term you want to use. And that seems like just obviously the case. I don't think that it necessarily ought to be the case in a perfect world, but don't you think someone like your favourite Gretchen Whitmer, who I am always talking up here, or some of the other female candidates, even AOC, do you not think there is a perception that gender or race in the case of black candidates may hurt people with the general electorate?
No, I think AOC, it'll be that she has much. I mean, I'm not even sure with the general electorate. With the Democratic Party, the primary, she's going to get attacked by the establishment for having out-of-the-box views I don't agree with. I don't really think it has to do with her gender. I mean, you looked at the most recent 3 elections, but you know that's leaving off the MVP of the Democratic Party is Barack Obama, a black man who performed spectacularly well in terms of general election appeal. So I think it has to do more with the politics of the person, but you know, Barack Obama had a kind of moderate style or I mean, he was a very good and effective communicator that both somehow captured progressive aspirations, but was temperamentally moderate in some way that, you know, say what you will about your feelings on his politics, but was successful in terms of winning elections. I think it's more about you know, how the establishment views your politics, rather race and gender being a proxy for that sometimes, but not in all cases. I mean, Bernie Sanders is someone with, I would say, very outside the establishment of the Democratic Party. You might say they're popular beliefs, but that they're not super popular. They're not the things Democratic elites want to run on. But yeah, he's a boring old conventional white guy otherwise, but he's not, you know, and that's the lens you get put in, but it's really not about that. It's about the politics of the person. And I'm not sure where to, frankly, to slot Jasmine Crockett on that because I'm not as familiar with her politics. I don't know that she's really a full-on AOC type person.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair enough. Look, first of all, I think in relation to President Obama, people even now don't, I think, fully recognize how exceptional a figure he was. And I mean that both in a praising way, but also literally exceptional. That tendency that he had, that you alluded to, where he sort of spoke with the rhetorical flourish of progressives, but is actually quite an incrementalist politician. And certainly, the famous convention speech back in 2004 was all about transcending American divisions and finding common ground. He's actually not politically a very radical figure. So his political skills plus that appeal make him just very, very unusual. In 2008, I remember all sorts of fears about the Bradley effect, which was going back 20 or 30 years before, the idea that white voters would say they would vote for a black candidate and in the end would not do so. Obama's election and re-election was a rebuttal to that argument. I do take the point that a Sanders-type figure, people outside the establishment, are treated with suspicion by that establishment. But I also think that Democrats in general are a little bit snake bit by the losses of both Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton, and that translates to a reluctance to nominate a woman again next time around.
Well, and gender and race are different things. There might be more of a gender thing than a race thing.
Possibly.
And it might just be the case. I would not bet against it being a safe white boy candidate.
Sure.
Josh Shapiro or Gavin Newsom. I think the front runners, to be clear, for the Democratic nomination in 2028 are Kamala Harris herself, if she decides to run, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, maybe Gretchen Whitmer, and maybe AOC. I think those are the 5 most likely people. There could be some out-of-the-box Stephen A. Smith character, but who knows? But that might just be a side effect that, if Josh Shapiro is the safe pick being alluded to here, it's because he's a popular governor of the must-win state. It doesn't really have anything to do with his race or gender, unless you think those were factors in him becoming elected. But he is popular enough in the state that Democrats have to win.
Sure.
And maybe Democratic elites, and this is not to their, this would be a good decision if they were like, you know what, we figured it out. Okay, we really need to win the Midwest. Let's have a strategy to do that this time. Would not be bad thinking on their part strategically. No,
I broadly agree with that, but I would say in relation to the relevance or salience of perhaps gender in particular, one of the most fascinating findings from the exit polls this time around, or last November, was that Latino men shifted to an enormous degree toward Trump, and Latina women did not really do so. Now, that seems to me to undercut the argument often made by conservatives or people on the online right. Oh, well, it's a sort of Latinos and Latinas generally prefer Trump's economic policies or something. That to me does at least imply that there was a gender component to that very significant shift among Latinos.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. I would not dismiss the gender thing. Right. I think it might be a more salient factor than race, frankly. But also Kamala's whole branding was, Mamala, that whole kind of thing that was really well liked by SNL and progressives. Seems to me like it was off-putting to young men, again, of all racial categories. Not a race thing, possibly a gender-based thing.
Yeah, no, that's not an implausible theory.
Interesting topic. Still ahead, Qatar is pulling out all the stops ahead of President Trump's visit this week, including a highly criticized multi-million-dollar gift, a jumbo jet. We'll talk about it. More Rising right after this. Many conservatives and even a few voices on the left think President Trump's Middle East peace plan is achieving some potential victories. Trump is hopeful that his administration is taking the right steps to end the Israel-Gaza conflict and even secure the release of a hostage. He wrote in a Truth Social post Sunday, "I am happy to announce that Edan Alexander, an American citizen who has been held hostage since October 2023, is coming home to his family. This was a step taken in good faith towards the United States and the efforts of the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, to put an end to this very brutal war and return all living hostages and remains to their loved ones."
Meanwhile, the war between India and Pakistan is heating up. The two had apparently come to a ceasefire agreement on Saturday, But now the nuclear-armed countries are accusing each other of violating it just hours afterward.
At the same time, the more hawkish wing of the Republican Party is displeased, and there's some feuding within MAGA world about it. Here's Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, in an interview with Breitbart News last week.
You're right. The neocon element believes that war is the only way to solve things. And the president believes that his force of personality, the way he is going to respond to situations, can bend people to do things in a much better way in the interests of the United States government, and I believe in that too.
Fox host Mark Levin bashed Witkoff. He said to save the name-calling for, quote, terrorist regimes like Iran rather than neocons. Levin wrote on X, LOL, the envoy talks like the fifth column isolationists. Nobody believes war is the only way. We wait with great interest to see the deal you're negotiating with the warmonger Iranian terrorist regime.
Vice President J.D. Vance jumped to Witkoff's defense, writing on X, pray that Hamas follows through and Edan gets to come home. If they do, it will have been another triumph of Steve Witkoff, who continues to face withering attacks for freeing hostages, negotiating complex diplomatic proposals, and serving his country at great financial cost. So we have a lot of Middle East topics to really go over today. I'm very glad to hear this news about the hostage being released. I think that's fantastic. And I think Witkoff's diplomacy on the Middle Eastern issue, I know you're not a fan of his diplomacy on the Russia-Ukraine front, but I think he's one of the cooler heads here in the Middle East situation, and that it is to the benefit of peace in the region. That's kind of been my theme of the day. I think averting conflict with Iran is good. I think de-escalating the Israel-Gaza situation is good. I think Trump's unconventional, to put it mildly, approach to foreign policy is really a boon in this region. And I think you have to acknowledge some positives here, no?
Well, I think that it is good that a hostage is released. I mean, I think that those people have suffered greatly. I think that, you know, I have been extremely critical of Israel's conduct in Gaza, and I think there are very, very, very valid reasons for that. That said, hostages have suffered a great deal, and this hostage apparently is going to be released. Where I have the problem, aside from with Israel's overall campaign, is that I think in recent times the Trump administration has in fact facilitated an approach that has caused suffering to a much greater number of people than in a way that is not counterbalanced by the release of one hostage. We have seen in recent weeks Israel choke off aid, food to the Palestinians in a way that has caused terrible suffering. There has been a renewal of a military campaign that has killed thousands more people. Israel, in essence, broke the ceasefire agreement, and the Trump administration has done very, very little about any of that. It's almost been a carte blanche. Now, is that changing? If it does, I will applaud it. There has certainly been some coverage in recent days here of purported tensions between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I would like to believe that was the case. I do think that when the more recent ceasefire deal was being negotiated, the Trump administration, to its credit, leaned on Netanyahu a bit, and Witkoff leaned on Netanyahu a bit at that point. But look, in the individual case, is the hostage being released good? Yes. Is the massive suffering being imposed on the people of Gaza bad? Yes. It's catastrophic. It's disgraceful. We shouldn't be supporting it or facilitating it.
Sure, I don't disagree with that. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know all the details, it seems to me, and we get conflicting reports, that the Trump diplomatic negotiating team has put more pressure, not universally across the board, and there are different people in the administration who want different, but you see that in this Mark Levin, Steve Witkoff battle, where, Mark Levin is someone who would support Israel under all circumstances, who blames Iran, says Iran is the warmongers and we should be tough as nails with them. That's a policy independent of the Bush administration, really independent of, not so different from what was happening under Biden. Biden people didn't tell Israel to stop at all.
No,
one iota, and which and have criticized them for. Is this the ideal policy that I want? No. Is it better at some points in some ways? I think so. Maybe that's weak comfort, and I don't like the suffering, certainly, of the people in Gaza, and I want to bring it to an end. It seems like more pressure is being brought at various points by some factions of the Trump administration, and that's a good thing, and Netanyahu's not particularly happy about it, but he can't cross Trump, and so we have gotten a pause. I hope we get another pause. That's part of what these conversations with Qatar are about as well, and it's all a little unsavory, but we got to deal with unsavory people in order to have peace. That's all I ultimately want is peace.
Sure. First of all, thank you for acknowledging that I've been very critical of was very critical of the Biden administration at the time in its conduct in that part of the world. I thought it was disgraceful. In relation to Trump himself, it's hard for me to get past the idea that he has effectively backed the idea of what I consider just ethnic cleansing, just removing people from Gaza. Now, if they get a deal, he talked in the Truth Social post we mentioned about bringing this brutal war to an end, I think was his phrase. If he succeeds in that, I think it would be obviously a good thing. If anyone succeeds in that, government of Qatar, anybody else, then I think they will have done some belated service to humanity. In relation to the Iran question, I do think, to be fair to the MAGA world type of people, that the sidelining of people like John Bolton has been to the general advantage of policy and of prudence in that policy. So that, I think, is fair enough. I do think it is interesting the way there has been this battle that you just outlined between the neocon people who still remain and people who are of a more isolationist tendency. I think, to some extent, there has to be a conflict-by-conflict approach as to what the right measures are. I don't, for example, agree with them on Ukraine and Russia, where I would be much more supportive of Ukraine. But, you know, if John Bolton has less influence on American policy regarding the Middle East, I think that's a good thing.
And on the other side of the aisle, you know, not to kick someone when they're down, but if Kamala Harris was going to do something dramatically different than Joe Biden and just rubber stamping everything that was going on, she had plenty of opportunity to explain that and just didn't, and clearly lost votes because of it. So now we're up again, you know, what the alternative would have been. Maybe it would have been better, maybe it would have been worse, maybe it would have been the exact same thing. She did not explain at all how it would have been different.
No, and even AOC, who I have defended here numerous times, is still getting flack from the left for that Democratic National Convention speech in which she said that Harris and Biden had been working tirelessly for a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, that's a fanciful claim and one that I think will continue to haunt AOC if she goes forward, as she perhaps might, with a presidential bid.
I think so.
The royal family of Qatar is giving Donald Trump a giant airplane, and people on both the right and left are raising objections. Qatar will gift a Boeing 747-8 jumbo jet, also called a Palace in the Sky, to be used as the new Air Force One.
Per Axios, Qatar will donate the luxury jumbo jet to the Department of Defense, and then it'll be transferred to President Trump's presidential library. In a Truth Social post on Sunday night, Trump wrote, "So the fact that the Defense Department is getting a gift free of charge of a 747 aircraft to replace the 40-year-old Air Force One temporarily in a very public and transparent transaction so bothers the crooked Democrats that they insist we pay top dollar for the plane. Well, anybody can do that. The Dems are world-class losers."
Democratic Representative Jason Crow wrote on X, "Accepting a $400 million Palace in the Sky plane from a foreign nation clearly violates the Constitution. Government officials cannot accept gifts, quote, from any king, prince, or foreign state," end quote. "This is the most corrupt president in history."
Even some big fans of Trump were not happy with this decision. Conservative TV host Dave Rubin wrote on X, "Qatar paid and housed Hamas leadership for years, and now we're taking a new Air Force One from them. Trump's first misstep." And then Emily Jashinsky of Unheard points out that Attorney General Bondi, who okayed the gift, was actually formerly a paid lobbyist for Qatar. Yeah, I was seeing this did not go over well, basically, with anyone.
Understandably, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know. You probably think it's obviously corruption and violence. So it's not going to belong to Trump, right? It's
ultimately going to
government.
Well, it's ultimately going to be used by his Presidential Library Foundation, where, the distinction between his Presidential Library Foundation and Donald J. Trump seems to me a distinction without a difference. It is true it is going initially to the Department of Defense. But come on, Robby, this is just, apparently this plane's worth $400 million. This is just a gift from a foreign nation to the President of the United States of the kind that is expressly prohibited under the Constitution.
A lot of memes about the Trojan horse. Like, what is that?
What's on board?
Terrorists in it? Well, look, I think the defense, I don't necessarily think there's specifically defense of this. We should just not take it. But, and most people feel that way and think that Qatar is a little overly influential in our politics. But, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, and I am, and you are, I think, mostly on board with this. I want a non-interventionist policy in the Middle East that necessitates diplomacy with some unsavory characters, with Iran, with Qatar doing back-channel negotiating with Hamas so that we can have peace in the Middle East. Some people would probably say on the non-interventionist side, if this is what it takes to get peace in the Middle East, then so be it.
That's a heroic effort, Robby. A heroic effort to justify pocketing a $400 million plane from a foreign government. And not a particularly nice foreign government at that. Now, I should say...
Not a nice foreign government, but we got to talk to people.
Well, I would say that I would also have an issue if Belgium, or Ireland for that matter, or Britain donated a $400 million plane to a President of the United States. I think that would be a bad thing. I think that if President Biden or Obama or, George W. Bush had accepted such a thing, there would be outrage across the board. And we seem to have become, in some way, anesthetized to these actions of Trump, which from any other president would be regarded as evidence of corruption on its face. Look at his meme coin thing, a really dubious mechanism to allow people, whether they're American or non-American, to just lob money his way. The originators of that have profited by about $320 million already, and it is essentially an unchecked way to buy favor with the President of the United States.
But is it buying favor that brings us closer to a peaceful resolution to these really awful conflicts that you spoke very impassioned about just now, about the horror and the death? It's not ideal. He's no saint. There's no way around it. Yeah. But all these previous presidents that you just mentioned, who you're right, they wouldn't have taken a jumbo jet. They would have made the American taxpayers pay for it. Those people greenlit policies that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths because they do everything nice and prim and proper, and they're good, morally upstanding, non-corrupt individuals who oversaw calamity after calamity in this region of the world.
Robby, the argument that you're making is essentially corruption is beneficial because it may lead us to advantageous
I'm not saying that corruption is beneficial.
Goals.
I'm saying there is corruption, and that might just be the corruption has nothing to do with it. The person we're having this position is unfortunately evincing corruption, but is at the same time presiding over a more restrained foreign policy in line with the view that the American people actually want.
But if the argument is about the nature of foreign policy, topics that I or other people are impassioned about, the point is that we want the policy to be driven by the right considerations to avoid death or destruction or involvement. We don't want it to be driven by who gave him the best plane or who gave him what is effectively a bribe.
I would avoid World War III with Iran at all costs. And if the cost is a jumbo jet, I will pay it. It's not ideal, but to me, the cost on the other side of how much of a catastrophe that would be I weight that so heavily that I'm not overlooking the other things. This is bad. We should not do it. Should not accept it. It's not good. It's not good that Bondi was overly sympathetic to the Qataris for this reason. The Qataris have too much influence over a whole lot of people. But at the end of the day, I'll take someone who's not going to bring us to World War III with Iran. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can see podcasts. See you later.